Judge Sarah Mitchell's day began like any other in Boston's criminal court building, with the soft golden rays of dawn streaming through her chamber's Victorian windows. At 52, she had developed a morning ritual as predictable as the sunrise itself. Arrival at 6:30 a.m., coffee from her personal machine, never the break rooms, and the gentle rituals of preparing her courtroom for the day ahead. Her grandfather's gavel had been her constant companion through 15 years on the bench. A piece of polished oak, worn smooth by 3 generations of judicial wisdom, it represented everything she believed about justice. Firm but fair, strong yet tempered by wisdom. As morning light caught its surface, Sarah noticed for the first time how the wood had aged, developing nearly invisible hairline cracks along its length. "Good morning, Your Honor," her clerk, James, called from the doorway. He was early, too, as always, his arms laden with case files. At 28, he reminded her of herself at that age, ambitious, idealistic, and thoroughly dedicated to the law. "Morning, James. Anything unusual today?" Sarah asked, reaching for her grandfather's gavel to place it in its familiar spot. The moment played out in slow motion. Her fingers brushed the handle, and a sharp crack echoed through the chamber. The gavel, which had sentenced thousands of cases, split cleanly in two. Both pieces clattered onto her desk, rolling in opposite directions as if trying to escape what was coming. "That's certainly not a good omen," James muttered, his usual professional demeanor cracking slightly. He shifted uncomfortably, clutching his files closer to his chest. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm June morning. "My grandfather would say it's just old wood finally giving up," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "What's troubling you, James? You've got that look." James stepped forward, placing a single file on her desk. "There's been a last-minute case reassignment to your courtroom. Judge Peterson was supposed to handle it, but he called in sick this morning. His first sick day in 7 years, apparently." Sarah raised an eyebrow. Peterson was known for presiding over cases through everything from flu to fractured bones. "That's unusual for him. What's the case?" "High-profile financial fraud. The defendants being brought in from county. The FBI's involved, though they're being oddly quiet about certain details." James hesitated. "There's something else, Your Honor. 2 other judges were approached before your name came up. Judge Martinez had a sudden family emergency, and Judge Chen discovered a conflict of interest." Sarah's eyes narrowed. In 15 years on the bench, she'd never seen such a convergence of coincidences. She glanced at the broken gavel, its 2 pieces now lying still on her desk like fallen soldiers. "The timing feels wrong," she said, more to herself than James. "Who's prosecuting?" "Catherine Walsh from the DA's office. Defense counsel is Martin Green." Sarah knew them both. Walsh was a piranha in a power suit, while Green was known for taking cases that were more complex than they appeared on the surface. An interesting pairing for what should have been a straightforward fraud case. The morning light caught the edge of the case file, highlighting the red UrGNT stamp across its cover. Sarah reached for it, her fingers hesitating for just a moment above the folder. "Your Honor," James prompted. "Sometimes, James, the law presents us with moments that feel more like fate than justice." She opened the file, her eyes moving to the defendant's name. In that moment, the morning sun chose to duck behind a cloud, casting her chambers in sudden shadow. The coffee cup in her other hand slipped, shattering against the floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. But Sarah didn't move to clean it up. She couldn't move at all. Her eyes were fixed on the name that had just changed everything. *State versus Michael Cooper*. Time seemed to stop in her chambers, the only sound the slow drip of coffee from her desk to the growing puddle below, each drop marking a second in a countdown she didn't yet understand. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she stared at Michael Cooper's name, memories crashing over her like waves in a storm. The case file's contents blurred before her eyes as her mind catapulted back 30 years, to a frozen day that had carved itself permanently into her memory. Lake Thompson, December 1994. The ice had seemed solid enough to the two teenagers seeking adventure on that bitter winter afternoon. Sarah had been showing off, skating backward, laughing at Michael's exaggerated clumsiness. Then came the crack, a sound that still haunted her nightmares. The world had turned to freezing darkness until Michael's strong hands pulled her from the black water, his own body half submerged in the deadly cold. "Your Honor." James's voice snapped her back to the present. "You're as pale as the papers you're holding." Sarah forced herself to focus on the defendant's photo clipped to the file. The man in the mugshot bore little resemblance to the boy who had saved her life. Michael's once bright blue eyes were now shadowed, his formerly strong jaw hidden beneath an unkempt beard. But there was no mistake. It was him. "James, I need you to pull something from my personal files," she said, her voice barely steady. "In my cabinet, there's a red folder marked 1994. Inside, you'll find a letter." While James searched, Sarah read through Michael's charges: securities fraud, wire fraud, elderly exploitation. The list seemed endless. The total amount: $12 million, stolen from retirement accounts of senior citizens. Her mind couldn't reconcile these accusations with the boy who had once given his college savings to help his elderly neighbor pay for her husband's funeral. "Found it," James announced, holding up a yellowed envelope. The paper was creased from being unfolded and refolded countless times over 3 decades. Sarah took it with reverence, though she didn't need to read it again. The words were burned into her memory. "Dear Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. What happened at the lake changed everything. There are things I have to do, promises I have to keep. One day, you'll understand why today had to happen this way. Michael." She had never understood. The day after the lake incident, Michael had disappeared from their small Connecticut town. No goodbye, no explanation beyond this cryptic note. His family moved away shortly after, and all her attempts to find him had led nowhere. "Your Honor, given your history with the defendant, we should discuss recusal," James said carefully, watching his mentor's face. Sarah glanced at the calendar on her wall. "Who's available to take the case?" James shuffled through some papers. "With Judge Peterson sick, Martine's out, and Chen's conflict. No one, not for at least 6 weeks. The defendant has already been in custody for 3 months awaiting trial." The gravity of the situation settled over Sarah's shoulders like a heavy robe. The law was clear about judicial conflicts of interest, but it also guaranteed the right to a speedy trial. Every available judge had mysteriously become unavailable, and a man she once knew, a man who had saved her life, sat in a cell awaiting justice. "James, what would you say if I told you this case feels like it was intentionally steered to my courtroom?" Her clerk's expression turned serious. "I'd say that's a very troubling suggestion, Your Honor. And," he hesitated, "I'd say the timing of Judge Peterson's first sick day in 7 years is suspicious at best." Sarah stood, walking to her window. Below, a prisoner transport van pulled into the courthouse's secure entrance. Even from 6 floors up, she could see the high-risk transport marking on its side. "Get me everything you can on Michael Cooper's life for the past 30 years, she ordered. "And James, let's keep this quiet for now. Something tells me this case is about much more than financial fraud." As if in response, a distant roll of thunder echoed through the city streets. The storm that had been threatening all morning was finally rolling in, much like the one brewing in Sarah's courtroom. Sarah's chambers had become a war room of sorts, with papers spread across every surface. James had pulled files from the courthouse archives, digital records, and even newspaper clippings dating back to the mid-1990s. The timeline they pieced together of Michael Cooper's life after leaving Connecticut was fragmented at best, suspicious at worst. "It's like he deliberately lived in the shadows," James muttered, squinting at his laptop screen. 10 years working for various investment firms, but always in middle management, never drawing attention. Then 5 years ago, everything changes after his wife's death. Sarah looked up sharply. Wife's death. What happened? Car accident, according to the reports. But James tapped a few keys. There's something odd. The investigating officer noted signs of brake tampering, but the case was suddenly closed. All follow-up investigations were mysteriously dropped. A knock at the door interrupted them. Court Officer Martinez entered, his face tense. "Your Honor, the FBI is here. They're asking about Judge Peterson's absence." "Send them in," Sarah replied, exchanging glances with James. They hastily cleared some of the scattered papers. 2 agents entered, a tall woman with steel gray hair and a younger man whose suit looked fresh from the rack. The woman spoke first. "Judge Mitchell, I'm Special Agent Diana Hawkins. This is Agent Torres. We need to discuss your position on the Cooper case." Sarah's judicial mask slipped perfectly into place. "I wasn't aware the FBI had any say in judicial assignments." "We don't," Hawkins admitted, "but we have concerns about potential conflicts of interest." "Interesting." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "Yet you weren't concerned when the case was steered away from 3 other judges this morning." A flicker of surprise crossed Hawkins' face. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "Let me be direct, Agent Hawkins. In 15 years on the bench, I've never seen such a coordinated effort to funnel a case to a specific judge. The question is, why me?" Torres shifted uncomfortably, but Hawkins maintained her composure. "Judge Mitchell, what do you know about Operation Icarus?" The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Icarus, the code word she and Michael had used as teenagers for their secret meetings by Lake Thompson. There was no way this was coincidence. "Should I know something about it?" Sarah kept her voice neutral. "That's classified," Hawkins replied. "But I can tell you this. Michael Cooper isn't who you think he is. Neither his crimes nor his presence in your courtroom are accidental." James cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the defense and prosecution teams have arrived. They're waiting in the conference room." Sarah stood, straightening her robes. "Agent Hawkins, unless you're planning to formally intervene in this case, I have a trial to prepare for." "One last thing." Hawkins placed a business card on the desk. "When you figure it out, and you will, call this number. Any time, day or night." After the agents left, Sarah sank back into her chair, her mind racing. James waited quietly, knowing she needed space to think. Finally, she spoke. "James, get me everything you can on Operation Icarus, and find out who visited Judge Peterson last night before he suddenly called in sick." "You think he was threatened?" "I think nothing in this case is what it seems." Sarah picked up the broken pieces of her grandfather's gavel. "The law demands I recuse myself due to prior connection with the defendant, but something tells me it would be exactly the wrong thing to do." Thunder rumbled outside as the storm intensified. Sarah watched raindrops race down her window, remembering another day when water had nearly claimed her life, and Michael Cooper had been there to save her. "Your Honor," James said softly, "what are you going to do?" Sarah placed the broken gavel pieces in her drawer. "I'm going to see this through, James. Something much bigger than fraud is playing out in my courtroom, and I have a feeling Michael Cooper isn't the real criminal here." The courthouse bells chimed 10 times. In 30 minutes, she would face Michael Cooper across her courtroom for the first time in 30 years. And somehow, she knew, those long-ago events at Lake Thompson were just the beginning of their story. The tension in courtroom 4B was palpable as Sarah took her seat at the bench. Her eyes swept across the gallery, noting the unusual number of spectators for what should have been a routine fraud case. Among the sea of faces, a familiar one caught her attention. Rachel Cooper, Michael's sister, now a renowned investigative journalist known for exposing corruption in the judicial system. Rachel hadn't changed much in 30 years, the same sharp green eyes and determined set of her jaw. She sat in the second row, notebook poised, watching Sarah with an unnerving intensity. Their gazes locked for a moment, and Rachel gave an almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something only she understood. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "Criminal case number 2024 CR 789. State versus Michael Cooper. The Honorable Judge Sarah Mitchell presiding. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 2 court officers led Michael Cooper in, his hands and feet shackled. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They weren't the defeated eyes from his mugshot. They were alert, calculating, scanning the courtroom with the precision of someone looking for specific faces. When his gaze finally met hers, something passed between them. A flash of recognition, a shared memory of ice-cold water and desperate survival. Michael's expression shifted subtly, and for a split second, Sarah saw the ghost of a smile play across his lips. The court notes the presence of Catherine Walsh for the prosecution and Martin Green for the defense, Sarah announced, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. Mr. Cooper, do you understand the charges against you? Michael's voice was rougher than she remembered, but still carried that familiar hint of quiet confidence. Yes, Your Honor. Catherine Walsh rose, her red blazer a splash of blood against the courtroom's muted tones. Your Honor, the state has concerns about potential conflicts of interest given your history with the defendant. Noted, Ms. Walsh, Sarah replied coolly. I assume you filed the appropriate motions. That's just it, Your Honor. Walsh's smile was razor-sharp. When we attempted to file this morning, we discovered that all records of your connection to the defendant had been sealed by federal order. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. In the gallery, Rachel Cooper began writing furiously in her notebook. Objection. Martin Green stood, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the prosecutor. The defense has received no notification of such sealed records, which violates discovery protocols. Sarah noticed Michael's hand twitch at the word protocols, another ghost from their past. They had created elaborate codes and protocols as teenagers, playing at spies and secrets. Now those games felt less like childhood fantasy and more like preparation. Court will recess for 1 hour while I review these allegations, Sarah announced, her gavel conspicuously absent. As she rose, she caught sight of Agent Hawkins slipping into the back of the courtroom, phone to her ear. In her chambers, James was waiting with a stack of newly delivered files. Your Honor, you need to see this. I found something about Operation Icarus. Before he could continue, Sarah's private line rang. A number she hadn't seen in decades. Her mother's voice came through, shaking with urgency. Sarah, don't trust the records. The lake incident. There's something you don't know, something I've kept secret all these years. Through her chamber window, Sarah could see Rachel Cooper in the courthouse parking lot, engaged in an intense conversation with Agent Hawkins. Above them, storm clouds continued to gather, darkening the mid-morning sky to an ominous twilight. Mom. Sarah gripped the phone tighter. What do you mean? What really happened at the lake? The answer would change everything she thought she knew about Michael Cooper, about that day on the ice, and about the true nature of the case now unfolding in her courtroom. Sarah's mother's words echoed in her mind as she re-entered the courtroom. The men who came that day weren't paramedics. They were federal agents. Michael didn't just save you from drowning. He saved you from them. The prosecution's first witness took the stand. Harold Winters, a retired schoolteacher who had lost his entire pension to Michael's alleged scheme. His testimony was heart-wrenching. Stories of lost dreams, a canceled cross-country trip to see grandchildren, the shame of returning to work at 72. But something felt off. Mr. Winters, Catherine Walsh paced before the witness box. Could you identify the man who convinced you to invest your savings? That's him right there. Winters pointed at Michael, though he called himself Marcus Collins back then. Sarah noticed Michael's expression didn't change, not even a flicker of reaction to the accusation. She'd seen enough guilty men in her courtroom to know this wasn't the face of one. Martin Green rose for cross-examination, his large frame moving with surprising grace. Mr. Winters, you testified that you met Marcus Collins in June 2023 at First Hartford Bank, correct? That's right. Your Honor, Green produced a document. I'd like to enter Defense Exhibit A into evidence. These are security footage screenshots from First Hartford Bank, dated June 2023. The images showed a man who resembled Michael Cooper meeting with Winters, but Sarah spotted what others might miss. The man in the photos was right-handed. Michael had always been distinctly left-handed. It was why they'd created their special left-handed secret handshake as kids. As the evidence mounted, a pattern emerged. Each victim described meetings with Marcus Collins, each supported by seemingly ironclad documentation. But tiny inconsistencies appeared: a wrong-handed signature, a scar on the wrong cheek, a height difference of 2 inches. During a brief recess, James rushed to Sarah's chambers. "Your Honor, I found something about Operation Icarus. It wasn't just a code word you and Michael used. It was the name of an FBI operation in 1994 investigating corruption in Connecticut's financial sector. The case went cold when a key witness disappeared, right after a teenager almost drowned in Lake Thompson." Sarah's blood ran cold. "I was the distraction," she whispered. "Someone tried to silence a witness that day, and Michael saved your life by making it look like an accident." James finished. "But why is it all coming back now?" The afternoon session brought a surprise witness. Catherine Walsh called Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Judge Chen's wife, to the stand. "Dr. Chen," Walsh began, "please tell us about your investment meetings with the defendant." Objection. Green was on his feet. Dr. Chen wasn't on the witness list. "Overruled," Sarah said quietly. "But proceed carefully, Ms. Walsh." Dr. Chen's testimony revealed another layer. She described not just losing money to Marcus Collins, but discovering irregularities in several high-profile judges' investment accounts, including her husband's, explaining his sudden recusal. As Dr. Chen spoke, Sarah observed Michael. He was writing something, his left hand moving swiftly. The court officer confiscated the note, delivering it to Sarah as protocol required. The paper showed no words, only a series of numbers. 12 to 1794, the date of the lake incident. Below it, a crude drawing of a broken gavel. Sarah's heart raced. Michael had known her grandfather's gavel would break, just as he had known she would be the judge today, just as he had orchestrated this entire performance. In the gallery, Rachel Cooper closed her notebook and slipped out a side door. Through the window, Sarah saw her meet with Agent Hawkins again, passing something between them. The pieces were starting to align. This wasn't a trial about financial fraud. It was about exposing something much bigger: corruption that had festered for 30 years, reaching into the highest levels of the justice system. And Michael Cooper, the boy who had once saved her life, needed her to play her part one more time. The courtroom doors burst open just as Catherine Walsh was preparing to call her next witness. Heads turned as an elderly man in a wheelchair was pushed in by a nurse. Despite his frail appearance, Thomas Reeves, their former high school teacher, commanded attention with his mere presence. "Your Honor," Green stood immediately. "The defense calls for an immediate recess." "Denied," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on her old teacher. She noticed Michael's shoulders tense. This wasn't part of his plan. Reeves insisted on standing as he took the oath, his voice weak but determined. "Before I begin," he said, "I need to confess something I've carried for 30 years. Something about Michael Cooper, Judge Mitchell, and what really happened in 1994. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to where her grandfather's gavel should have been. The gallery fell silent, and even Catherine Walsh seemed caught off guard. "I was more than their teacher," Reeves continued, his voice growing stronger. "I was part of a federal task force investigating corruption in the Connecticut banking system. Michael's father, Charles Cooper, was my key informant." Rachel Cooper stood abruptly in the gallery, her face pale. This was news even to her. On December 17, 1994, Reeves pressed on. Charles Cooper was supposed to deliver documents proving widespread judicial corruption. But someone found out. They didn't just want to stop him. They wanted to send a message. They planned to target his son's closest friend. Sarah felt the room spin. "Me," She whispered, though in the silent courtroom, everyone heard. Yes, Judge Mitchell. The ice on Lake Thompson was deliberately weakened the night before. They expected 2 teenagers to be reckless enough to skate there. But they didn't count on Michael's training. Training. Sarah turned to Michael, who met her gaze steadily. Charles Cooper had prepared his son, knowing this day might come. Michael recognized the signs of tampering. He got to the lake early that morning to warn you, but you were already on the ice. So he did the only thing he could. He turned their assassination attempt into a rescue scene. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Agent Hawkins moved closer to the front, her hand inside her jacket. After that day, Reeves continued. Charles Cooper disappeared. The investigation was buried. Michael and his family were relocated under federal protection. But the corruption continued, growing deeper, spreading through the system like a cancer. And now? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand. Now, 30 years later, we're watching the same pattern. Judges being compromised, evidence disappearing, witnesses being silenced. But this time, we have what we didn't have before. Someone on the inside willing to risk everything to expose it. Michael Cooper finally spoke, his voice carrying across the stunned courtroom. The fraud charges are real, Your Honor. But I didn't commit them. I discovered them. Every victim who testified today was targeted by the same network my father tried to expose. Marcus Collins is their front man, carefully designed to look just enough like me to make the charges stick. Objection. Walsh shouted, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Overruled, Sarah said quietly. Continue, Mr. Cooper. Each of those investment accounts leads back to a shell company called Icarus Holdings, the same company that appears in my father's original evidence from 1994. The same company that owns properties connected to 3 recently appointed federal judges. Thomas Reeves slumped in his wheelchair, exhausted but satisfied. I'm dying, Your Honor. Cancer. But before I go, I needed to set this right. The truth about that day at the lake needed to come out. Sarah noticed Agent Hawkins speaking urgently into her phone, while Rachel Cooper was typing rapidly on her laptop, no doubt preparing to break the story that would shake the judicial system to its core. The past and present had finally collided in her courtroom, and Sarah Mitchell realized that the real trial was just beginning. The tension in courtroom 4B had reached a breaking point. Catherine Walsh was visibly shaken, her usual composure cracking as she whispered frantically with someone on her phone. In the gallery, reporters who had caught wind of the unfolding drama were slipping in quietly, their presence adding to the electric atmosphere. Your Honor, Martin Green stood. The defense requests permission for Mr. Cooper to take the stand. Sarah nodded, knowing this moment had been 30 years in the making. As Michael walked to the witness box, she noticed he palmed something from his attorney, a small flash drive, concealed expertly in his sleeve. Mr. Cooper, Green began, please tell the court about Operation Icarus. Michael leaned forward, his voice steady. Operation Icarus wasn't just an FBI investigation. It was my father's life work. He discovered that certain judges weren't being appointed. They were being installed. Every major financial fraud case in the past 3 decades has been strategically assigned to compromised judges. The courtroom doors opened again. Agent Hawkins entered with a team of FBI agents, positioning themselves around the room. Sarah caught the agent's subtle nod. They were ready. The real Marcus Collins, Michael continued, is a master of disguise, trained to impersonate targets. His job was to create a trail of evidence connecting me to the fraud. But he made mistakes. Small ones, like using the wrong hand to sign documents. Objection. Walsh stood abruptly. This is all speculation without. Actually, Michael interrupted, reaching into his sleeve. It's not. This drive contains 30 years of evidence. Account numbers, shell companies, offshore transfers, and video footage of Marcus Collins meeting with members of the Judicial Appointment Committee. In a flash, Walsh drew a concealed weapon. That drive goes nowhere. Chaos erupted. FBI agents drew their weapons as Walsh backed toward Michael, using him as a shield. Sarah noticed something crucial. Walsh was now standing directly under the courtroom sprinkler system. "Ms. Walsh," Sarah spoke calmly, her hand moving to the emergency panel under her bench, "you should know that my grandfather taught me more than just how to use a gavel. He also taught me about courtroom security systems." She pressed the button. The sprinklers activated, but instead of water, a fine mist of incapacitating gas filled the air above Walsh and Michael. It was a security measure installed after 9/11, known only to a few judges. Walsh staggered, her grip loosening. Michael, who had been holding his breath, a trick Sarah remembered him using during their swimming days, spun away. FBI agents swarmed in, securing Walsh as Rachel Cooper captured everything on her phone. "The evidence on this drive," Michael said once order was restored, "shows that Marcus Collins is actually Jeffrey Walsh, Catherine Walsh's brother. They'd been working together for years, manipulating cases, controlling verdicts." Agent Hawkins stepped forward. "Ms. Walsh, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice. We've already arrested Marcus Collins at his hotel. Your brother was kind enough to cooperate once we presented him with evidence of your betrayal." Sarah watched as Walsh was led away, then turned to Michael. "You orchestrated all of this, getting assigned to my courtroom, the broken gavel. You needed a judge you could trust." "I needed more than that," Michael replied. "I needed someone who understood what it meant to sacrifice everything for the truth. Someone who'd believe me because they knew who I really was." Rachel Cooper approached the bench, her journalist's credentials displayed. "Your Honor, every major news outlet in the country is about to break this story. A decades-long conspiracy to control the judicial system, exposed in your courtroom. Care to comment?" Sarah looked at the broken pieces of her grandfather's gavel, then at Michael Cooper, the boy who had saved her life, the man who had trusted her to help him save justice itself. "The only comment I'll make is this. The truth, like justice, finds its way to the surface. Sometimes it just needs a little help from old friends." 1 week later, Sarah Mitchell sat in her chambers, surrounded by newspaper headlines that told the story of what was now being called the Icarus revelation. The New York Times lay on top. Largest judicial corruption scandal in U.S. history, exposed in Boston courtroom. Beside it, the Washington Post declared, 30-year conspiracy unraveled by judge and former childhood friend. A knock at her door preceded James's entrance. "Your Honor, he's here." Michael Cooper entered, wearing a suit this time instead of prison orange. Freedom looked good on him. Rachel followed close behind, still protective of her brother even after all these years. "The Attorney General's office called," Sarah said, gesturing for them to sit. "They're offering you full immunity in exchange for your testimony against the corrupt judges and Marcus Collins. 12 federal judges indicted so far," Rachel added, her journalist's instincts never resting. "My sources say it could go as high as 20 by next week. The entire judicial appointment system is being overhauled." Michael picked up the broken pieces of the gavel from Sarah's desk. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said justice finds a way." "How did you know it would break that morning?" Sarah asked, the question that had been nagging at her. Michael smiled. "I didn't, but I knew you'd keep it all these years. Your grandfather made it from wood taken from the old Lake Thompson dock. The same dock we used to sit on. Wood gets brittle with age, especially wood that's witnessed as much history as this piece has." Speaking of history, Sarah reached into her desk drawer. "There's something you should have." She handed him the letter he'd written 30 years ago, edges worn from countless readings. Michael unfolded it carefully. "I wrote this the night my father told me we had to disappear. He gave me 5 minutes to say goodbye to my entire life. This letter was all I could manage." "Agent Hawkins confirmed your father's alive," Rachel said softly. "They're bringing him out of witness protection next week." Sarah watched as tears formed in Michael's eyes at this news. Some wounds could heal, even after 30 years. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, opening a long box on her desk. Inside lay a new gavel, made from dark walnut. My grandfather had two made. This one was supposed to be for my wedding day. But, she smiled, I think this occasion is more fitting. She lifted it out, feeling its weight. This courtroom has seen enough of the old justice system. It's time for something new. Michael stood, straightening his tie. I should go. The FBI has about 1,000 more questions for me. He paused at the door. Sarah, thank you. For believing in me. For being the same person you were on that lake. Someone who wasn't afraid to break the ice when truth was on the line. After he and Rachel left, Sarah walked to her courtroom. It was empty now, peaceful in the late afternoon light. She placed the new gavel on the bench, its polished surface reflecting the sun. James appeared beside her. Judge Peterson just pleaded guilty. He's naming names. Good, Sarah nodded. The truth has a way of cascading once it starts flowing. The papers are calling you a hero, James said. Sarah picked up the new gavel, remembering a frozen lake, a brave boy, and a 30-year journey to justice. There are no heroes in justice, James. Only people willing to stand up when standing is hardest. She looked out at her courtroom, where tomorrow new cases would be heard, new truths would emerge, and justice, real justice, would continue to find its way. Your Honor. James gestured to the door, where her next appointment waited, ready to get back to work. Sarah smiled, setting the gavel in its proper place. Some things had changed forever, but this remained constant. The daily work of justice, the weight of truth, and the courage to pursue both, no matter the cost. Ready, she said, smoothing her robes. Let's begin.